My name is Sarah Bennett, and the most humiliating moment of my life happened at a Thanksgiving dinner table with 14 people watching. The house smelled like roasted turkey, cinnamon, and sweet potatoes, and everyone was already a little loud from the wine my father kept refilling. My mother loved hosting big family holidays. She liked the attention. She liked having people sit around the long oak table while she told stories about her successful family. That night, my older sister Emily sat beside her wearing her white coat because she had just come straight from the hospital. My mother loved that detail. She made sure everyone noticed it. She stood up near the head of the table holding a glass of wine and tapped it lightly with a fork to get everyone's attention. The room slowly quieted down. 14 people turned toward her. Some were relatives, some were neighbors, and a few were my parents' friends who always came to these holiday dinners. My mother smiled proudly and placed her hand on Emily's shoulder. "I just want to say how proud I am of my daughters," she began. Emily gave a polite smile while people nodded. Then my mother continued, "One daughter is a doctor." The guests immediately started clapping and cheering for Emily. My mother waited until the noise settled before she finished the sentence. "And the other one is just the maid." She turned toward me while laughing like she had just delivered the funniest joke of the evening. A few people chuckled awkwardly. Others looked down at their plates. Emily smiled politely, but didn't say anything. My father laughed louder than anyone else. I felt 14 pairs of eyes slowly turn toward me across the table. For a second I thought maybe my mother would stop there, maybe she would change the subject and move on to dessert like nothing had happened. But she didn't. She kept talking. "Emily saves lives every day," my mother said, proudly lifting her glass again. "And Sarah..." She glanced at me with that same amused smile she had used since I was a kid. "Well, at least someone has to clean things." The table erupted in laughter this time. Real laughter. My father wiped his eyes like it was the best joke he had heard all year. Someone at the far end of the table whispered something I couldn't quite hear, and more people laughed quietly. I sat there, holding my fork, staring down at my plate, while the sound filled the room. For most of my life, I had been the daughter my parents joked about, the one they compared to Emily, the one who didn't live up to the family potential. But that night, something inside me felt different. Maybe it was because there were 14 witnesses. Maybe it was because my mother wasn't just teasing anymore. She was presenting me like I was the punchline of a story. And the worst part was, she wasn't finished yet. She lifted her glass again and turned back toward Emily. "At least one of my daughters turned out successful," she said proudly. Everyone looked at my sister again, smiling and nodding, and that was the moment I finally spoke. But before I tell you what I said that made 14 people go completely silent, I want to ask you something. If you were sitting at that table and heard a mother say that about her own daughter, would you stay quiet or would you say something back? Comment 1 if you would stay quiet to keep the peace. Comment 2 if you would say something and embarrass them right back. For most people at that table, my mother's joke probably sounded like harmless family teasing, the kind of thing relatives say at holidays after a couple glasses of wine. But for me, that sentence wasn't new. It was just the loudest version of something I had been hearing my entire life. Growing up in our house meant growing up beside Emily. My sister was 2 years older than me, and according to my parents, she had been extraordinary since the day she learned to walk. She spoke early, read early, and by the time she reached high school, she was already the kind of student teachers used as an example for everyone else. My parents loved telling the story about how Emily finished her first science fair project 3 weeks early and spent the rest of the time helping other students fix their experiments. They told that story so often that sometimes it felt like I had been there just to watch her succeed. I was the opposite. Not because I wasn't smart or capable, but because I never fit the picture my parents wanted to show the world. I moved slower. I thought longer before speaking. When teachers asked questions in class, Emily's hand shot up instantly. I usually raised mine after I had finished thinking through the answer. That difference became a kind of label in our family. Emily was the brilliant one. I was the quiet one. At first it sounded harmless, but over the years those labels slowly turned into expectations. My parents expected Emily to succeed in everything she did. and they expected me to fall slightly behind her in every comparison. When Emily brought home perfect grades, my parents framed the report card and hung it on the refrigerator. When I brought home good grades that were just a little lower, my mother would smile politely and say something like, "Well, at least you tried." The words sounded supportive, but the meaning was always clear. Trying was something you said to the child who wasn't winning. By the time we reached high school, the difference between us had become part of how my parents introduced their daughters to other people. If guests came over for dinner, my mother would proudly say, "Emily wants to be a doctor someday." Then she would gesture toward me and add something softer like Sarah is still figuring things out. I hated that sentence. Not because I didn't know what I wanted to do, but because she said it like my future was something uncertain and disappointing at the same time. The truth was, I had always liked working with my hands. While Emily studied biology and chemistry, I spent time learning how to fix things. I worked part-time jobs, cleaning houses in our neighborhood during high school, and I quickly discovered something interesting. I liked the work. Not the cleaning itself, but the independence that came with it. People paid me directly for the results of my effort. No comparisons, no expectations. Just a simple exchange, work done, money earned. My parents hated that job from the beginning. My mother called it embarrassing. "We didn't raise you to scrub other people's bathrooms," she told me once, when she found out I had taken another cleaning client. But the more she complained, the more determined I became to keep doing it. Because every time I finished a job, I earned something. Emily never had to think about my own money. By the time I graduated high school, I had saved enough from those jobs to buy used cleaning equipment and start working for more houses in our town. What began as a part-time job slowly turned into something bigger. I started helping older homeowners who needed regular cleaning and maintenance. Then they recommended me to their friends. Within 2 years, I wasn't just cleaning houses anymore. I had built a small cleaning service with several regular clients and a waiting list for new ones. My parents never saw it that way. To them, I was still just the daughter who cleaned houses. Meanwhile, Emily went to medical school exactly the way everyone expected. Every holiday dinner turned into another celebration of her progress. First, it was getting accepted into medical school. Then it was passing her exams. Then it was starting her residency at a large hospital in the city. My parents loved telling everyone about it. They would show photos of Emily in her white coat while guests admired her dedication and intelligence. Whenever my name came up in those conversations, my mother's tone always changed slightly. "Sarah works." "Cleaning houses," she would say carefully, like she was explaining something unfortunate but unavoidable. Sometimes she laughed when she said it like it was a quirky family story everyone should find amusing. Over time, I stopped correcting her, because explaining my business felt pointless to people who had already decided what it meant. By the time that Thanksgiving dinner arrived, Emily had just completed another major milestone at the hospital. My parents were thrilled. They invited relatives, neighbors, and even a few family friends to celebrate the holiday together. 14 guests in total. My mother spent days preparing the house, decorating the dining room, and planning a dinner that looked more like a formal event than a family gathering. When I arrived that afternoon, I already knew exactly how the evening would unfold. My mother would praise Emily, guests would admire her success, and eventually, someone would ask about me. That was when my mother would tell the story she always told, the one where Emily was the doctor, and I was the maid. The only thing my mother didn't know that evening was this. The house I cleaned most often in our neighborhood wasn't just another client's home anymore, and by the time Thanksgiving dinner ended, everyone sitting at that table was about to find out why. By the time Emily started medical school, the story my parents told about their daughters had become so familiar that even our relatives repeated it without thinking. At family gatherings, someone would always say something like, "Emily is going to be an incredible doctor someday." Then they would look at me with a polite smile that felt more like sympathy than interest. And Sarah, well, she's doing her cleaning work. The way they said the word cleaning always sounded smaller than the reality of what I was doing. But I stopped correcting people years ago, because explaining my life to someone who had already decided what it meant was exhausting. Instead, I focused on the one thing that actually mattered, the work itself. What started as a simple cleaning job during high school had slowly grown into something I never expected. At first, it was just me and a few houses in our neighborhood. Elderly couples who needed help with weekly cleaning. Busy families who didn't have time to manage everything themselves. I showed up early, worked carefully, and made sure every client felt like their home mattered. That simple approach did something powerful. People started recommending me. Within a year, I had more clients than I could manage alone. That was when I hired my first employee, a woman named Teresa who had been struggling to find steady work after moving to our town. Teresa was reliable, hardworking, and grateful for the opportunity. Together, we doubled the number of houses we serviced each week. By the time Emily finished her second year of medical school, my small cleaning job had quietly turned into a full cleaning service with 3 employees and dozens of regular clients. We weren't just cleaning houses anymore. We handled maintenance tasks, seasonal, deep cleaning, and move-in preparations for several real estate agents in the area. I spent most of my days managing schedules, hiring new workers, and making sure every client received the same careful service that had built our reputation in the first place. But none of that ever appeared in the story my parents told people. To them, the situation was still simple. Emily was becoming a doctor. And I cleaned houses. Sometimes my mother even joked about it during family dinners. One evening she laughed and said, "At least if Emily ever spills something on her hospital coat, we know who can clean it." Everyone laughed politely. I forced a smile and changed the subject. The strange thing about those jokes was that they stopped hurting after a while. When you hear the same insult repeated enough times, it eventually loses its power. What my parents didn't understand was that while they were busy celebrating Emily's progress, my business had quietly become something much bigger than the maid job they liked to laugh about. By the time that Thanksgiving dinner arrived, I was managing 8 employees and coordinating cleaning services for more than 60 homes across 3 neighborhoods. We had contracts with 2 real estate agencies and a local property management company that handled several rental buildings in town. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was stable, growing, and completely my own. I didn't need my parents' approval to make it successful. And for the most part, I was perfectly happy keeping it that way. The only person who ever saw the real scale of what I was building was Mrs. Thompson, one of my earliest clients. She was a retired widow who lived in a large historic house at the edge of town. When I first started cleaning there during high school, she had been one of my very first regular customers. Over the years, we developed something that felt less like a client relationship and more like a quiet friendship. She would often sit in the kitchen while I worked, telling stories about the neighborhood from decades earlier or asking questions about my business. Unlike most people, she never spoke about my work with embarrassment or amusement. She treated it like what it actually was, a growing company. One afternoon, about 6 months before that Thanksgiving dinner, she said something that changed everything. I had just finished cleaning the living room when she called me into the kitchen. She was sitting at the table with several documents spread out in front of her. "Sarah," she said gently, "you've been helping me take care of this house for years now." I nodded. "And you've done more than just clean it," she continued. "You've helped me keep it running." I wasn't sure where the conversation was going yet, so I simply listened. She slid one of the papers toward me. "I've decided to move into assisted living next spring," she said calmly, "which means this house will need a new owner." I looked down at the paper. It was a property listing document. "You're selling it?" I asked. She nodded. "But before I list it publicly, I wanted to ask you something first." I glanced back up at her. "Would you ever consider buying it?" For a moment, I thought she was joking. The house was beautiful, historic, and far larger than anything I had ever imagined owning. "Mrs. Thompson," I said slowly, "I don't think I could afford something like this." She smiled gently and tapped the stack of documents on the table. "That's why I called my lawyer." She explained that she planned to sell the house below market value because she trusted me to take care of it the way she had. She also told me something else that surprised me even more. She believed the property could become the perfect headquarters for my cleaning company. The house had multiple spare rooms, a large garage, and enough space to operate as both a home and a business office. For the first time in years, I felt something unexpected rise in my chest. Not embarrassment, not doubt, opportunity. And the best part was that no one in my family knew anything about it yet, especially not my mother, who would soon be introducing me at Thanksgiving dinner as the maid. When Mrs. Thompson first suggested that I buy her house, my immediate reaction was disbelief. The property was easily the largest and most beautiful home I had ever worked in. It sat at the end of a quiet street lined with tall maple trees with wide front windows that filled the living room with afternoon light and a wraparound porch that overlooked a small garden she had maintained for decades. I had cleaned every corner of that house for years, and I knew exactly how much care it required. The idea that I could actually own it felt almost impossible. "I think you're overestimating what I can afford," I told her carefully. Mrs. Thompson only smiled in that patient way she always had when she thought I was underestimating myself. "You've been running a successful business for several years now," she said calmly. "And I know you've been saving." She wasn't wrong about that. From the very beginning, I had treated my cleaning work differently than most people expected. Every payment from clients went into 2 separate accounts, one for operating costs and one for savings. I rarely spent money on anything unnecessary. While Emily's life was filled with tuition bills and student loans, my life had quietly become something very different. My business didn't just pay my bills. It was building something stable. Over the years, I had accumulated more savings than my parents would have ever believed possible from a maid job. Still, buying a house like Mrs. Thompson's would require more than savings. It would require confidence that the future of my company was strong enough to support it. Mrs. Thompson seemed to sense the hesitation in my silence. She slid another document across the table. "Take a look at this," she said. It was a preliminary agreement her lawyer had prepared, outlining the price she was willing to accept. When I saw the number, I blinked twice to make sure I had read it correctly. The price was nearly 30% lower than the estimated market value of the property. "Why would you sell it for this much less?" I asked. She folded her hands calmly on the table. "Because I'd rather see it belong to someone who appreciates it." I looked down at the paper again, my mind already racing through calculations. Mortgage payments, business income projections, employee salaries, maintenance costs. All the numbers lined up in my head the same way they always did when I evaluated a business decision. Slowly, the impossible idea began to feel realistic. If I did this, I said carefully, I'd need to use part of the house for my business. Mrs. Thompson smiled immediately. That was exactly my thought. Over the next 2 months, we worked with her lawyer and a local bank to finalize the details. The process required patience and careful planning, but every step brought the possibility closer to reality. By early autumn, the paperwork was complete. I had purchased the house. The moment the bank approved the final documents, I stood alone in the empty living room holding the keys in my hand. For a long time, I simply looked around at the place I had once entered as an employee. Now it was mine. The house became more than just a home. It became the headquarters of my company. One room turned into an office where I organized schedules and client contracts. The garage stored cleaning equipment and supplies. The upstairs bedrooms remained living space, quiet and comfortable in a way that felt completely different from the house I grew up in. Within a few months, the business expanded again. With more space and better organization, I was able to hire 2 additional employees and take on larger property contracts. Our company now handled cleaning services for several rental properties, 2 small office buildings, and dozens of residential homes across town. The income from those contracts easily covered the mortgage payments and operating costs. But I kept all of that information private, not because I was ashamed of it, because I had learned something important about the way my parents saw the world. To them, success only looked legitimate if it came from certain professions. Doctor, lawyer, executive. Those were the titles that impressed them. Owning a cleaning company would never sound impressive in their story. And honestly, I didn't need it to. My life had quietly become stable, independent, and mine. By the time Thanksgiving arrived that year, I had been living in the Thompson house for almost 3 months. My parents didn't know I owned it. They assumed I was still renting a small apartment near the edge of town. When my mother called to invite me to Thanksgiving dinner, her voice carried the same cheerful tone she always used during family holidays. "We're having a full house this year," she said proudly. 14 guests. Everyone's excited to hear about Emily's work at the hospital. I could already imagine how the evening would go. My mother would stand at the head of the table and tell the same story she always told. One daughter, the doctor, the other daughter, the maid. Normally, I would have declined the invitation politely and spent the evening at home. But something about this year felt different. Maybe it was because I had spent months building a life completely separate from their expectations. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in my life, I had nothing left to prove to them. Either way, I said yes. And a few hours later, I walked into that Thanksgiving dinner where 14 people were about to hear my mother introduce me as the maid. What none of them realized at that moment was that the house they were sitting in had just been cleaned by the woman who now owned the biggest house on their street. When I arrived at my parents' house that Thanksgiving afternoon, the driveway was already full of cars. My mother always treated holidays like social events, and this year was no different. Through the front window, I could see people moving around inside the house, carrying dishes and glasses, while the smell of roasted turkey drifted all the way out to the porch. I took a slow breath before ringing the doorbell. Not because I was nervous about seeing my family, but because I already knew how the evening would unfold. I had watched the same pattern repeat itself for years. The door opened almost immediately. My mother stood there wearing a bright smile and an apron dusted with flour the way she always did when guests were around. "Sarah," she said loudly enough for the people inside to hear. "You made it." She stepped aside so I could walk in, but the first thing she did wasn't greet me privately. Instead, she turned toward the living room where several guests were sitting. "Everyone, Sarah's here," she called out. A few heads turned toward the doorway. Some of the guests waved politely, while others simply nodded in recognition. I recognized most of them. 2 of them were my aunt and uncle from my father's side. Another couple were neighbors who had attended Thanksgiving at our house for years. The rest were friends of my parents who seemed to appear at every holiday dinner. 14 guests in total, just like my mother had proudly mentioned on the phone. My father walked over from the dining room carrying a bottle of wine. "There she is," he said with a grin. "The famous cleaner." A few people chuckled politely. I forced a small smile and stepped inside. Emily was standing near the kitchen counter talking with 2 of my mother's friends. She was wearing a dark sweater instead of her white coat now, but the conversation still revolved around her hospital work. When she saw me, she gave a quick wave and walked over to hug me. "Hey," she said softly. "Good to see you." Unlike my parents, Emily had never been openly cruel about my job, but she had also never corrected them when they joked about it. She simply let the conversation happen the way it always did. We moved into the dining room where the long oak table was already set. My mother loved decorating for Thanksgiving. Candles lined the center of the table, surrounded by small bowls of cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes, and stuffing. Every seat was filled within minutes as guests settled into their places. I ended up near the far end of the table between my uncle and one of my father's neighbors. The conversation started casually the way holiday dinners always do. People talked about travel plans, work schedules, and the weather. But it didn't take long for the topic to shift exactly where my mother wanted it to go. "Emily just finished another rotation at the hospital," my mother said proudly, while passing the turkey platter across the table. Immediately, several guests leaned forward with interest. "Really?" one of the neighbors asked. "What department?" Emily smiled politely. "Emergency medicine this month." My father nodded proudly. "She barely sleeps these days," he added. "But that's what dedication looks like." The table filled with admiration. Guests asked Emily questions about patients' long shifts and the challenges of hospital life. She answered each one confidently, describing her experiences in a way that made everyone listening even more impressed. I focused on my plate, quietly eating, while the conversation flowed around me. None of this surprised me. I had seen the same scene play out dozens of times before. Eventually, just as I expected, someone at the table asked the question that always brought the conversation to me. It was my aunt this time. She glanced toward my end of the table and smiled politely. "And Sarah," she said, "what are you doing these days?" The room grew slightly quieter as several people turned their attention toward me. My mother didn't give me time to answer. She laughed softly and waved her hand dismissively. Oh, Sarah still does her cleaning work, she said. She's basically the maid. A few guests laughed lightly the way people do when they're not sure if something is meant to be a joke. My father leaned back in his chair, clearly amused. Every family needs someone to keep things tidy, he added. More laughter followed. I kept my eyes on my plate for a moment, listening to the sound of 14 people reacting to the story my mother loved telling about her daughters. One daughter, the doctor. The other daughter, the maid. For years, I had let the moment pass quietly. But that night was different, because this time when my mother lifted her glass again and prepared to praise Emily one more time, I already knew exactly what I was going to say next. And none of the 14 guests at that table were ready for it. My mother lifted her wine glass slightly the way she always did when she wanted to guide the attention of the entire table back to her. The candles flickered softly between the dishes, while 14 people waited for her to continue the story she had started. I could see the familiar pride on her face as she turned again toward Emily. You know, she said with a warm laugh, Emily has always been the one we knew would succeed. My father nodded in agreement beside her. She works harder than anyone I know, he added proudly. Emily gave a small, embarrassed smile and lowered her eyes slightly, but she didn't interrupt the praise. Several guests murmured their agreement. One of my mother's friends leaned forward and said, Becoming a doctor takes incredible dedication. My mother looked delighted by the attention. Exactly, she said, pointing her fork slightly toward Emily. That's what I always tell people when they ask about my daughters. She paused just long enough to let the admiration settle across the table. Then she glanced toward me again with the same amused expression she had used earlier. And, Sarah? She continued, shaking her head slightly as if the comparison itself was humorous. Well, she's our maid. This time the laughter was louder. Not cruel laughter exactly, but the kind that spreads quickly through a group when someone makes a joke that feels socially acceptable. My father chuckled openly. One of the neighbors tapped his glass lightly against the table, as if the line deserved applause. For a second, I simply listened. The sound of the laughter felt strangely distant, like it belonged to another room. I looked around the table, slowly meeting the eyes of several guests, who suddenly seemed unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. Some of them avoided my gaze completely. Others smiled awkwardly and returned to their food. Emily reached for her glass and took a sip of water without saying anything. My mother leaned back in her chair, clearly satisfied with the reaction she had received. Well, she said cheerfully, at least someone in the family knows how to save lives. My father nodded again, raising his glass toward Emily. To our doctor, he said proudly. Several people lifted their glasses to join the toast. The sound of glass touching glass echoed softly around the table. That was the moment something inside me finally shifted. Not anger, not embarrassment, just a quiet realization that I didn't need to let the story end the way it always had. For years, my mother had told the same version of our family story in front of relatives and guests. Emily the doctor, Sarah the maid. It had always been simple for her because she believed everyone at the table understood exactly what those words meant. But this year, the story wasn't that simple anymore. I placed my fork down carefully and looked toward my mother. She noticed the movement immediately. What is it, Sarah? She asked with a playful smile, clearly expecting another quiet response. For a moment, I said nothing. I let the silence stretch just long enough for a few people at the table to notice. Then I spoke. Actually, I said calmly, I do clean houses. My mother nodded quickly, thinking I was agreeing with the joke. See, she laughed. She admits it herself. A few people chuckled again. But I continued before the laughter could grow. The interesting part, I added quietly, is the house I clean the most. My father raised an eyebrow slightly. Oh, I looked down the table toward him and then back at my mother. It's a very large house, I said. Beautiful porch. Big maple trees out front. My mother frowned, slightly confused by the description. That sounds familiar, one of the neighbors said slowly. Isn't that the old Thompson place? I nodded. Yes. My mother leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Thompson still lives there, doesn't she? For the first time that evening, I allowed myself a small smile. Not anymore, I said calmly. The table grew quiet again, but this time it wasn't because of laughter. Several guests looked between my mother and me, waiting for the rest of the sentence. My mother blinked once, clearly trying to understand why I had brought up the house. "What do you mean, not anymore?" she asked. I folded my hands calmly on the table and looked directly at her. "Because I bought it." The words landed softly, but they carried through the entire dining room like the sudden stop of music. 14 people stared at me in complete silence. My father lowered his glass slowly. Emily looked up from her plate with a surprised expression. My mother opened her mouth as if to respond, but for the first time in years she didn't have a joke ready. For several seconds after I said it, the dining room was completely silent. The candles flickered quietly in the middle of the table, while 14 people stared at me as if they had misheard the sentence. My father was the first person to move. He lowered his wine glass slowly and leaned forward slightly. "You bought it," he repeated. His tone wasn't angry or amused anymore. It was confused. My mother looked at him, then back at me, as if hoping someone else at the table might explain what I meant. "The Thompson house?" she asked carefully. I nodded once. "Yes." The silence stretched again. Several guests glanced at each other before looking back toward me. One of my father's neighbors spoke first. "That house is worth a lot of money," he said cautiously. "Mrs. Thompson sold it." "She did," I answered. Emily finally set her fork down and leaned slightly closer to the table. "When did this happen?" she asked. "A few months ago." She looked surprised, but also curious, like she was trying to fit this new information into the story she had always heard about my life. My mother still hadn't fully processed what I had said. She gave a small laugh, though. It sounded forced now. "Well, that's wonderful," she said slowly. "You must be renting it." Then I shook my head. "No." The room grew quiet again. "I bought it," I repeated calmly. My father leaned back slightly in his chair, studying my face the same way he used to study business proposals from his employees. "With what money?" he asked. It wasn't meant to sound rude. It was a practical question. My answer was simple. My business. A few people at the table shifted in their seats. They had expected another joke or explanation that would bring the conversation back to the familiar pattern. But nothing about this conversation was familiar anymore. My mother tried to laugh again. "Your cleaning job?" she asked lightly. I met her eyes across the table. "My cleaning company?" I corrected. That single word company seemed to land heavier than anything else I had said. Emily blinked in surprise. "You have a company?" she asked. I nodded. 8 employees. The reaction around the table was immediate. Several guests sat up straighter. One of the neighbors raised his eyebrows. My uncle glanced at my father as if waiting to see how he would respond. For years, my parents had described my work like it was a small side job, something temporary, something slightly embarrassing. But now, 14 people were hearing something very different. My father rested his elbows on the table and folded his hands slowly. 8 employees, he repeated. His voice carried the tone he used when evaluating business numbers. "Yes. And you bought the Thompson house with that business?" "Yes." My mother stared at me like she was seeing a stranger sitting at the table. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked quietly. I thought about that question for a moment before answering. Because every time someone asked what I did, I said calmly, "You told them I was the maid." The room fell silent again. This time the silence felt heavier. One of the guests cleared his throat softly, but didn't speak. Emily looked down at her plate for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. My father glanced at my mother briefly before returning his attention to me. "What kind of work does the company do?" he asked. The question surprised several people at the table. For the first time that evening, he sounded genuinely interested instead of amused. "Residential cleaning," I explained. "Property maintenance for real estate agencies. 2 office contracts." My uncle whistled quietly under his breath. "That's not a small operation." I shrugged slightly. It grew over time. My mother was still trying to catch up with the reality of the situation. But, "You clean houses," she said again, as if repeating the idea would make it simpler. I nodded. "Yes." Then I added the sentence that changed the atmosphere of the entire room, including the one I live in now. 14 people sat in complete silence as the meaning of those words settled over the table, because suddenly the story my mother had been telling for years didn't sound like a joke anymore. And for the first time in my life, everyone at that table realized the maid had built something none of them had ever bothered to look at closely. The silence around the table didn't disappear right away. It settled into the room slowly, like the air had suddenly become heavier than before. A few minutes earlier, the dinner had been loud with laughter and casual conversation. Now 14 people were staring at me in a way that felt completely different from the amused curiosity they had shown earlier. My father was the first to speak again. He leaned back in his chair slightly and studied me with the same careful expression he used when evaluating business ideas. 8 employees, he said again quietly, almost like he was testing how the words sounded. And property contracts, I nodded. 2 office buildings and several rental properties. My uncle shook his head slowly. That's a real company, he muttered under his breath. One of the neighbors looked toward my father. You didn't know about this? He asked. My father hesitated for a moment before answering. No, he admitted. The honesty in his voice surprised me more than anything else that evening. My mother, however, still looked like she was trying to hold on to the old version of the story she had been telling for years. Well, she said, carefully, forcing another small smile, cleaning businesses can do well if people work very hard. The sentence sounded polite, but the tone carried a faint trace of the same dismissive attitude she had always used. Before I could respond, one of the guests at the far end of the table spoke up. It was Mr. Collins, a real estate agent who had known my parents for years. Wait a second, he said slowly. Sarah, do you run Bennett Property Cleaning? I looked toward him and nodded. Yes. His reaction was immediate. He sat up straight in his chair and let out a short laugh of disbelief. I knew that name sounded familiar, he said. Your company handles cleaning for several of our rental turnovers. The reaction around the table changed instantly. A few guests turned toward him with curiosity. That's a big contract, someone said quietly. Mr. Collins nodded. They're one of the most reliable companies we work with. My mother blinked in surprise. You've worked with Sarah's business, she asked. Of course, he replied. They handle some of our highest-end properties. My father's eyes moved back toward me this time with a level of interest that hadn't been there before. How long has the company been operating? He asked. Almost 5 years. My uncle leaned forward slightly, and it grew to 8 employees in that time, yes. A quiet murmur passed through the guests again. Emily finally looked up from her plate and studied me more carefully than she had all evening. You built all of that yourself? She asked. Yes. Her expression wasn't judgmental or dismissive anymore. It looked thoughtful, like she was seeing a part of my life she had never really asked about before. My mother glanced between all of us, clearly realizing the conversation had slipped far beyond her control. For years, she had told the same simple story about her daughters. Emily the doctor, Sarah the maid. It had always been easy for guests to understand, but now the people sitting around the table were hearing something much more complicated. My father finally spoke again. The Thompson house, he said slowly. That's a valuable property. Yes, you purchased it through the business. Partially, and through savings. The numbers were easy for me to explain if anyone asked, but no one at the table seemed ready to dig that deeply yet. They were still adjusting to the basic reality of the situation. My mother tried one more time to bring the conversation back toward familiar ground. Well, she said carefully, it's nice that Sarah enjoys the work she does. But before the comment could settle into the old pattern, my uncle interrupted her. Enjoys it, he repeated. She owns a company with 8 employees. The room went quiet again. This time the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful, because the people sitting at that table were beginning to realize something my parents had never taken the time to notice. The maid they had laughed about a few minutes earlier wasn't just cleaning houses. She had built a business strong enough to buy one of the most valuable homes in the neighborhood. My father folded his hands slowly on the table and looked directly at me. Why didn't you ever tell us? He asked again, I thought about that question carefully before answering, because every time someone asked what I did, I said calmly the story was already finished before I could speak. No one laughed this time. 14 people sat quietly at the table, realizing that the story they had heard all evening had never actually been the whole truth. And my mother, the person who had started the joke in the first place, was still searching for something to say that could bring the moment back under her control. But there are some moments in a conversation when the story changes permanently, and everyone in that room could feel that this was one of them. For the first time that entire evening, no one at the table was looking at Emily. All 14 pairs of eyes were focused on me. The candles in the middle of the table flickered softly, while the room stayed quiet, like everyone was waiting for the next piece of information to finally explain what had just happened. My mother shifted slightly in her chair, clearly uncomfortable with how the conversation had turned. For years, she had controlled the narrative at family gatherings. She decided which stories were told, which achievements were celebrated, and which details were quietly dismissed as unimportant. But tonight, the story had slipped away from her before she even realized it. She tried to smile again, though the expression looked strained now. "Well," she said slowly, "I suppose that's impressive." Her voice carried the tone people use when they are trying to sound supportive without fully understanding what they're supporting. But cleaning houses is still very hard work. The sentence sounded harmless enough, but the meaning behind it was familiar. She was still trying to place my success into the small category she had always assigned it to. Something practical. Something humble. Something that didn't challenge the version of reality she preferred. Before I could respond, Mr. Collins spoke again from the far end of the table. "It's more than hard work," he said. "Her company saved us during a huge property turnover last spring." My mother turned toward him with visible confusion. "Saved you," he nodded. "We had 3 houses that needed full cleaning and repairs in 2 days before new tenants moved in. Every other company turned us down." He glanced toward me. "Sarah handled it." My father leaned forward slightly. 3 houses in 2 days. Mr. Collins nodded again. "She brought a full team. They worked through the night. We've used her company ever since." The story changed the atmosphere around the table again. What had started as a simple revelation about my business was now turning into something more detailed. Real examples, real work, real success that the guests sitting there could understand. My uncle chuckled quietly and shook his head. "That sounds like better management than half the companies I deal with," he said. A few people laughed softly, but this time the laughter felt different. It wasn't directed at me. Emily rested her elbows lightly on the table and looked at me with a thoughtful expression. "You really built all of that without telling anyone?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes." "Why?" The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. I glanced briefly toward my mother before speaking. "Because it never seemed important to anyone." The honesty of the sentence landed harder than I expected. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. My father looked down at the table for a moment before lifting his eyes back to me. "It would have been important to know," he said quietly. I studied his face for a moment. For the first time that evening, he didn't look amused or dismissive. He looked like someone realizing he had overlooked something valuable for a very long time. "Maybe," I said calmly. But every time someone asked what I did, the answer was already decided. My mother looked at me sharply when I said that. She knew exactly what I meant. The room grew quiet again, but now it was a different kind of silence. Not awkward. Reflective. 14 people were thinking about the same thing at once. How easily the story of someone's life can be reduced to a single label. Doctor, maid, success, failure. Simple categories that make the world easier to explain, even when they aren't completely true. My father cleared his throat softly. 8 employees is significant, he said. "Do you plan to expand the business further?" The question surprised several guests. It sounded less like small talk and more like a genuine business discussion. I nodded. "Yes." "How many clients do you have now?" "Around 60. My uncle let out a low whistle. "That's a serious operation." My mother looked around the table slowly, noticing the way people were now speaking about my work with a level of respect she hadn't expected. The shift in tone was subtle but undeniable. The same guests who had laughed at the joke earlier were now asking questions about my business like it mattered. Emily finally leaned back in her chair and smiled slightly. You know, she said thoughtfully, I think Mom might have introduced the wrong success story tonight. A few guests laughed softly again, but this time the laughter didn't feel like a joke at my expense. It felt like the moment the room finally understood what had really been happening all along. And my mother, the person who had started the entire story with a single sentence, was still sitting at the head of the table, realizing that the label she had repeated for years no longer fit the person sitting across from. Here, because the maid she had joked about a few minutes earlier had just become the most interesting story anyone at that Thanksgiving dinner wanted to hear. The conversation around the table never returned to the easy laughter it had at the beginning of dinner. People were still talking, still passing dishes and refilling glasses, but the tone had changed. The story my mother had started earlier in the evening had quietly collapsed under the weight of new information, and everyone sitting there seemed to understand that something important had shifted. My father sat back in his chair for a moment, studying me the way someone studies a puzzle they had misunderstood for years. Then he finally spoke again. 60 clients, he said slowly, and 8 employees. I nodded. Yes. He gave a small, thoughtful nod of his own. That's a real business. The sentence sounded simple, but it carried more recognition than anything he had ever said about my work before. My mother looked down at her plate for a few seconds before speaking again. When she lifted her head, the confident smile she had worn earlier in the evening was gone. I didn't realize things had grown that much, she said quietly. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the closest thing to one I had ever heard from her about the way she talked about my life. I shrugged gently. You never really asked. The honesty of the answer made a few people at the table glance at each other. No one laughed this time. Emily looked between us with a thoughtful expression. You know, she said slowly, I think we all just assumed we understood what Sarah was doing. I gave a small smile. That happens a lot. Mr. Collins leaned back in his chair with a grin. Well, if this dinner was supposed to celebrate success, he said, I think we ended up hearing 2 good stories tonight. A few people chuckled softly. The mood around the table finally relaxed again, but it was a different kind of warmth than before. Earlier, the guests had been admiring Emily's achievements from a comfortable distance. Now they were also asking me questions about the business I had built. Someone asked how I managed scheduling for 60 homes. Another person wanted to know how I hired and trained employees. For the first time in years, the conversation included me, instead of talking around me. My mother listened quietly while the discussion continued. Every once in a while, she glanced in my direction as if she were still adjusting to the new version of the story unfolding in front of her. Eventually, the plates were cleared and dessert was brought out. Pumpkin pie, whipped cream, and coffee filled the table while the conversation slowly drifted back to lighter topics. But the earlier moment, the moment when the entire room went silent, never really disappeared. It hung quietly in the background of the evening, like a reminder of how easily people misunderstand each other when they rely on labels instead of curiosity. As the dinner finally came to an end, guests began standing up and gathering their coats. Several of them shook my hand before leaving, wishing me luck with the company or asking for a business card. Mr. Collins even joked that he might need to expand his contract with us next year. When the last guest stepped out the front door, the house grew quiet again. Only my parents, Emily, and I remained in the dining room. For a moment, none of us spoke. My father finally broke the silence. Well, he said with a small smile, that was an interesting Thanksgiving. Emily laughed softly. Understatement of the year. My mother looked at me for a moment, then sighed quietly. I suppose I shouldn't call you the maid anymore, she said. I met her eyes calmly. You never had to. She nodded slowly, accepting the answer. I picked up my coat and headed toward the door. As I stepped onto the porch, the cold evening air felt refreshing after the warmth of the dining room. The street was quiet, the same maple trees lining the road that surrounded the house I now owned. For most of my life, I had listened to the story my family told about me. The maid, the daughter who didn't measure up. But sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't argue with someone's version of your life. Sometimes the most powerful thing is simply building something real and letting the truth speak for itself when the moment finally arrives. Before you go, I'm curious about something. If you were sitting at that Thanksgiving table and someone introduced you as the maid in front of 14 guests, would you stay quiet like I did for years, or would you reveal the truth immediately? Comment 1 if you would stay quiet, to keep the peace. Comment 2 if you would say something and change the story right there at the table.